300 assassins materialized in the Galactic Senate Hall, blocking every exit with plasma rifles raised. Their target, the alien ambassador who held the swing vote on a treaty that would cripple a deadly syndicate. Standing in their path was a single, slender human in an ill-fitting AIDS uniform. The lead assassin laughed, a wet gurgling sound. "He's just one human. Dispose of him." They did not know he had spent 12 years in a secret kinetic warfare program. For him, the next 10 seconds stretched into a frozen gallery of targets. That man was a kinetic warfare specialist, a living weapon forged in a program that didn't exist on any coalition database. The ambassador didn't know his file. The assassin saw only a pale, slender aide. 10 seconds later, all 300 were unconscious or dead. The footage spread across 100 worlds, and the treaty passed unanimously. But the footage didn't explain the how. To understand what happened in that Senate hall, you have to go back 12 years, to a facility hidden on a moon no one talks about. Project Chimera, that's what they called it. A black site program buried beneath the surface of Europa's smallest moon, Thebe. The coalition doesn't acknowledge it exists, but for 12 years it took volunteers, broken soldiers, orphaned teens, anyone who wouldn't be missed, and trained them in a form of combat that pushed past every known human limit. Zero-gravity kill houses where one wrong move meant a snapped spine. Hypergravity simulators that crushed bones until they densified like forged steel. Neural conditioning that taught operatives to trigger a controlled adrenaline cascade, spiking heart rates to 220 beats per minute. At that threshold, perception dilates. Time slows to a crawl. 1 second stretches into a subjective 10, 15, 20 seconds. And in that frozen gallery, a trained mind can process targets, calculate trajectories, and dismantle threats before the enemy's synapses even fire. 60% of the recruits never made it out. The ones who survived were rebuilt at the cellular level. The coalition had tried everything else. Diplomatic security details, armored embassies, preemptive strikes. None of it stopped the assassinations that were reshaping galactic politics. So they turned to the Black Labs. Their goal: build a human weapon that could disappear in plain sight, guarding the most vulnerable targets without anyone knowing they were there. They needed guardians who didn't look like soldiers, who walked into a room unnoticed and left it in silence. The man who would become known as the Ghost of the Senate was one of Chimera's last graduates. His file is sealed, but insiders call him Cade. He'd been a street kid from the lower levels of Titan Station, surviving gang wars before the coalition found him. His file noted exceptional adaptability and a near-psychopathic calm under pressure. At 17, he entered the program. At 29, he walked out, pale, slender, still looking like a junior aide. His resting heart rate was 40 beats per minute. His reflexes were measured at 0.03 seconds to identify and neutralize a threat. He could go days without sleep. He'd been trained to read micro-expressions, biosignatures, and the subtle shift of weight that preceded a trigger pull. He was, in every sense, a predator disguised as prey. By the time the Krell Syndicate launched their ambush, Cade had already been working undercover for 3 months as a security consultant for Ambassador Jorak of the Lithari delegation. The Lithari were the swing vote on the Sentinel Accords, a treaty that would give coalition forces the right to board and search any vessel suspected of slaving in neutral space. For the Krell Syndicate, whose entire empire depended on trafficking sentient beings, this was an existential threat. They'd already tried bribing, blackmailing, and even vaporizing other delegates. Jorak was their last hope to kill the vote, and they were running out of time. The Senate was supposed to be the most secure building in the galaxy, but the Krell had spent years infiltrating its maintenance staff, bribing sensor technicians, mapping every blind spot. On the day of the vote, they activated their sleepers. 300 of their finest shadow operatives, smuggled in piece by piece, assembled in the ductwork, ready to strike. They wore phase shift suits that bent light around their bodies. They moved into position around the Grand Hall's pillars, ventilation shafts, and emergency exits. Their plan: annihilate the ambassador, even if it meant gutting every Lithari guard in the room. They chose the precise moment the ambassador rose to speak. 300 phase-shifted figures stepped out of the shadows, sealing every exit with a wall of plasma and chitin. The ambassador's guards froze. The Senate feed went silent. And Cade, standing forgotten in his ill-fitting aide's uniform, felt his heart rate climb from 40 to 220 in a single breath. What followed was not a fight. It was a 10-second lesson in the terrifying truth humanity had kept hidden for over a decade, that a cornered human, properly trained, is the most dangerous organism in the galaxy. The first assassin never saw the strike. To the senators watching, Cade was a blur, a smear of motion that violated the physics of normal human reaction. His palm drove upward into the assassin's chin, snapping the head back and severing the neural link to the spinal column before the finger could tighten on the trigger. He pivoted, already reading the microshifts of weight in the next two attackers. The plasma rifle of the first was still falling when Cade peeled it from lifeless claws, reversed the grip, and fired 3 bolts into a cluster of shadow-suited operatives rushing from the East Gallery. In the subjective time bubble of his own mind, he had all the room he needed. Each target was a static equation: distance, angle, threat priority. Their phase-shift suits bent light but not air displacement. He tracked them by the whispers of disturbed dust, by the scent of chitin polish, by the electric hum of charging weapons. The chamber's acoustics became a weapon. Cade targeted the assassin's communication nodes, small, vulnerable relays hidden behind the mandible plating. A single kinetic strike to each node created a feedback shriek that paralyzed their auditory senses, turning their coordination into chaos. The marble floor became a canvas. 10 assassins charged the central dais, seeking to overwhelm him with mass. Cade vaulted over the ambassador's desk, using the heavy Durasteel slab as a pivot point. His body twisted midair, legs scissoring, catching 2 necks in a single rotation. The crack of vertebrae was sharp, clinical, a sound that echoed through the silent feed. The Krell operatives had trained for resistance. They prepared for Lithari honor guards, for energy shields, for heavy pulse cannons. They had not prepared for a single human who could identify the structural weakness in their clustered formation and turn their own numbers against them. As the first wave collapsed, Cade moved to the second. He used a fallen assassin's kinetic armor plate as an improvised shield, deflecting plasma fire while closing distance. His strikes were textbook: disable the primary arm, collapse the supporting leg, neutralize the neural cluster at the base of the skull. Each movement was practiced 1,000,000 times in zero-G kill houses where the penalty for error was death. When the final assassin crumpled, the silence was absolute. Cade stood in the center of the carnage, his borrowed uniform spattered with ichor but his breathing already slowing from 220 to 90 beats per minute. He lowered his hands. He looked at Ambassador Jorak, whose mandibles hung open in a very un-Lithari expression of shock. "You're still on the floor," Cade said quietly. "Your speech." "They're waiting." The live feed cut off 15 seconds after the last assassin fell, but 15 seconds was an eternity in the data stream age. By the time Coalition sensors tripped the emergency kill switch, the footage had already been copied, compressed, and blasted across the extranet by 100,000 Senate staffers, journalists, and embedded intelligence agents. On New Terra, citizens crowded around public screens. On the industrial moons of Proxima, miners stopped their rigs to watch grainy replays. On the Krell homeworld, the Syndicate's ruling council watched in stony silence as 300 of their finest warriors were dismantled by a single human who looked like an overworked office clerk. The treaty passed the next morning. Unanimously. The Lithari delegation, visibly shaken, voted with the Coalition for the first time in a century. But that was not the story. The story was the ghost of the Senate, the pale human who could bend time. And for the first time in 30 years, the galactic public began to ask questions the Coalition didn't want to answer. How many more like him are there? What else have you been hiding? And who exactly created you? The answer to that last question sat in a bunker deep beneath Europa's crust, watching the footage with a cold, calculating expression. Director Aldrich Vance, the architect of Project Chimera, had spent 12 years building deniable weapons. He had not intended for one of them to become the most famous being in the galaxy overnight. Worse, the Krell Syndicate was not done. Their assassins had failed, but the Syndicate never invested in a single plan. Vance knew this because he'd read their playbook. He had defectors who told him about the secondary payload, something far worse than 300 soldiers. Something that had been activated the moment the assassins fell. And now, all he could do was watch the extranet feeds and wait for the next shoe to drop. Cade, meanwhile, was being debriefed in a sealed Senate annex, surrounded by coalition brass who regarded him with a mixture of awe and barely concealed terror. General Harriman, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, leaned across the table. "Son, you just changed the balance of power in the galaxy. The Krell know who you are now. They will come for you." Cade met his eyes. "I'm counting on it." The room went cold, because in that moment the exhausted, bloodied operative revealed the one thing no one had considered. He hadn't just defended the ambassador, he'd made himself bait, and the trap was already closing. The words hung in the stale air of the sealed annex. General Harriman leaned back, his scarred face unreadable. "Your bait," he repeated slowly as if tasting poison. Cade didn't blink. "The Syndicate has a secondary." "There's always a secondary. They sent 300 assassins as the visible arm. That means the invisible arm is something worse." Harriman exchanged a glance with the other brass. They'd all read the same intelligence briefs, but Cade had lived it. He knew how the Krell thought because they thought like predators, and predators always hunted in pairs. Director Aldrich Vance appeared on a secure hollow channel, his gaunt face filling the annex wall. His voice was flat, clinical, the voice of a man who'd buried too many experiments to count. "The secondary payload is a man. Designation, Chimera 6. You knew him as Elijah." Cade's composure finally cracked. For a fraction of a second, his resting heart rate spiked. Elijah, his batchmate, the only other operative to graduate from Chimera's final class. Elijah had been declared dead 7 years ago, vaporized in a freighter explosion during a deep cover op. Cade had mourned him. But the file Vance now pushed to the annex screens told a different story. The Krell had fished him out of the void, rebuilt him with their own twisted fusion of human and xeno enhancements, and spent the last 7 years turning him into their ultimate sleeper. Elijah wasn't a prisoner. He was a convert. He believed humanity was a plague that needed to be culled, and he'd been feeding the Syndicate intel on Chimera's protocols for years. "He's already in the building," Vance said. "We intercepted a brief activation ping from Sublevel 9. He's not alone. He's brought a Krell neural weapon, something new, something that doesn't show up on our sensors." The annex went cold. Sublevel 9 housed the Senate's main life support cores. A neural weapon down there could affect every organic brain in a 2-mile radius. The treaty vote hadn't ended the crisis. It had just relocated it underground. Cade stood. "I know where he'll go first. The one place I'd go if I wanted to break me." He moved toward the door. Harriman tried to block him, but Cade was already flowing past, a ghost in motion. "This is my fight, General. He's my batchmate. He knows all my tells. That means I know his." The Senator's Grand Hall was a forensic nightmare. Cleanup crews still hadn't finished tagging the bodies. Cade slipped through the cordons, ignoring the incredulous stares of guards and investigators. He wasn't heading for the exits. He was heading for the central dais where Ambassador Jorek had been standing during the ambush, because Elijah wouldn't waste time on life support if there was a chance to finish the primary objective. The ambassador was already in protective custody, but that didn't matter. The real target wasn't Jorek. It was the symbol, the senator's floor, the live feed, the galaxy's newfound fear of humans. Elijah wanted to burn that symbol to ash. Cade's instincts screamed. He dropped to a crouch just as a silenced kinetic round punched through the air where his head had been. The shot came from the gallery above, from a shadow that moved with chimera-trained precision. Elijah. The round embedded in the marble floor with a dull thwack, followed by a faint hissing sound. Not a standard slug. A bioweapon payload. Cade rolled behind the ambassador's Durasteel desk, his mind already cataloging the variables. The desk would hold for maybe 2 more shots. The hissing meant a delivery system, arrow poison likely targeting human DNA. "I was wondering how long you'd make me wait," a voice echoed from above. It was hoarse, scraped raw by alien surgeries. "You always did love a dramatic exit, Cade. But this time there's no extraction, just me, just you, just the way we trained." Cade didn't respond. He was already calculating the angle of ricochet, the weight of a fallen debris chunk, the location of the nearest power conduit. In the Chimera dojos, Elijah had always been faster with ranged weapons. Cade had always been better at improvisation. He reached out, grabbed the jagged edge of a broken marble tile, and hurled it at the gallery's glass railing. The shattering glass created a distraction, and Cade was already moving, sprinting into the open, not toward the gallery but toward the main power conduit on the far wall. Elijah's second shot missed by a hair, the toxin payload splattering against a column. "You can't outrun this, Cade. The Krell gave me something you never had. They gave me purpose." Cade slammed his fist into the conduit access panel, grabbed a live power cable and ripped it free. Sparks exploded and the overhead lights in the gallery flickered and died. In the sudden darkness, Cade spoke, his voice unnervingly calm. "Purpose. You let them rewire your brain, Elijah. You're not a weapon anymore, you're a tool, and tools break." The two Chimera graduates circled each other in the dark, two apex predators, and the Senate Hall, still stained with the blood of 300, was about to become the arena for a fight that would decide whether humanity's greatest strength became its ultimate liability. The darkness was a living thing now, thick with ozone and the faint chemical tang of Elijah's bioweapon payload. Cade moved through it like breath, silent, reading the shifts in air pressure that betrayed his former batchmate's position. Elijah had always favored the high ground, the sniper's perch. Cade knew every favorite position from 1,000 sparring matches. He also knew the one weakness Elijah could never fully correct, a slight drag in his left pivot, a remnant of a shattered ankle rebuilt with synth bone that never quite aligned. In the dark, that drag was a sonar ping. Cade threw the severed power cable across the gallery floor. The sparking wire drew a reflex burst of gunfire. Elijah fired 3 rounds in the direction of the noise. On the third shot, Cade exploded from behind a collapsed column, low to the ground, sliding across the marble on a path slicked with spilled coolant. He hit Elijah at the knees before the operative could realign his aim. The kinetic revolver, Elijah's trophy, taken from a dead Lithari guard, skittered into the shadows. The two Chimera graduates tumbled in a brutal, silent grapple. This was not a fistfight. It was a language only they spoke, joint locks that could snap bones in 3 directions, nerve strikes that targeted the exact pressure points amplified by their shared augmentation. Counters to counters drilled 10,000 times in zero-G. Elijah was stronger. The Krell had laced his muscle fibers with some alien polymer that turned his limbs into hydraulic pistons. But strength was not speed. Cade flowed around every strike, using Elijah's mass against him, deflecting, redirecting. He got a hand around Elijah's throat, thumb pressing into the neural cluster that controlled the augmented adrenal cascade. "You think you chose this," Cade hissed, face inches from Elijah's. "You didn't. They just told you a better lie than we ever did." Elijah's eyes, once human brown, now flickered with an alien bioluminescence. His smile was a rictus of sharpened teeth. "You're wrong. The Chimera lied to us about everything. We were never guardians. We were a plague, and the Krell showed me the cure." He twisted free with a surge of unnatural strength, hurling Cade across the floor. Cade slammed into the base of the central dais, the wind driven from his lungs. His vision swam. He had maybe 3 seconds before Elijah was on him. But he didn't need 3 seconds. He needed 1. Cade's hand closed around the jagged piece of marble he'd landed beside. He drove the shard upward into the gap between Elijah's augmented ribs, the exact seam where alien tech met human bone. The improvised blade severed the primary power conduit feeding Elijah's neural weapon interface. The device, a small crystalline implant at the base of Elijah's skull, shattered with a sound like breaking glass. The bioluminescence in Elijah's eyes flickered and died. For a single, suspended moment, the old Elijah surfaced. His face softened. "Cade, a breath. Finish it." Cade's hand tightened on the marble shard. And then, for the first time in 12 years, a Chimera operative disobeyed the program's most fundamental directive. He didn't kill. He didn't neutralize. He pulled the shard free, pressed his palm against the wound, and said, "No, you're coming back with me. We're both done being weapons." The extraction teams found them 5 minutes later, both alive. The Krell's neural weapon, a cascading psionic amplifier intended to activate sleeper protocols in every Chimera operative across the galaxy, was recovered intact. Its design revealed something far darker than a mere assassination plot. The Krell hadn't just wanted to kill the ambassador. They had intended to turn humanity's greatest protectors into its executioners. Had Elijah succeeded in activating the device, every Chimera graduate scattered across the Coalition's embassies, fleets, and strategic installations would have received a single command: terminate all human command structures. The Syndicate's plan was never about one vote. It was about hijacking humanity's own secret arsenal to eviscerate the Coalition from within. When the full report leaked, and it did leak inevitably within 48 hours, the galactic outcry was not just against the Krell. It was against the Coalition itself. The existence of Project Chimera, its methods, its recruitment of orphans, its 60% fatality rate, its unaccountable directorate, all of it spilled into the public domain. Riots broke out on a dozen core worlds. The Sentinel Accords passed, but the Coalition's political capital hemorrhaged overnight. Ambassador Jorek gave a speech thanking the human who saved his life, but even his words were laced with the question every species was now asking: if this was what humanity had hidden, what else were they hiding? Director Aldrich Vance resigned before the Senate could formally charge him. His final testimony was a single encrypted file sent to Cade's personal datapad. In it, Vance spoke in the same clinical monotone, but with a sliver of something that might have been pride. "You were always the best of them, not because you killed, because you learned when not to. The program is dead, but you're not. Don't let them put you back in a cage." Cade watched the message from a secure medical bay, Elijah unconscious in the bed beside him, the marble shard long since removed. The galaxy outside was tearing itself apart over the question of what to do with the remaining Chimera operatives, but that was a fight for another day. For now, the man who had dismantled 300 assassins in 10 seconds sat in the quiet hum of life support machines, staring at his own bandaged hands, and made a quiet promise to the brother he'd refused to kill, that when Elijah woke, they would walk out of this together. Not as weapons, as men. And then they would remind the galaxy exactly what a human was capable of when they chose forgiveness over annihilation. The story of the Ghost of the Senate is not just about one man's impossible speed. It is about what happens when a species builds weapons it cannot control, and the quiet, terrifying truth that the most dangerous weapon of all might be the one that learns to say no. Cade's choice to spare Elijah did not just end a fight. It rewrote the program. It proved that the survival instinct drilled into him over 12 brutal years could be overruled by something older and far more human: the refusal to kill a brother, even when that brother had become a monster. The questions the galaxy now faces have no easy answers. How many more Chimera graduates are out there, hidden in plain sight, their loyalties unknown? What happens when the Krell recover and adapt? And what does it say about humanity that our greatest secret was not a weapon of mass destruction, but a weapon of mass protection that we could no longer trust? These are not just political questions. They are moral ones, and they will define the next century of interstellar relations. If stories like this resonate with you, tales of human defiance and the thin line between weapon and protector, then make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Hit the bell so you never miss a new episode. Until next time, remember, the scariest thing in the universe isn't strength, it's a conscience.